Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, we're on chapter 21, section 2. Yesterday, we talked about those Greeks and how the Greeks don't like the Turks because the Turks in the Ottoman Empire dominated and ruled them until 1821. Something like that. And also general age of ideologies, general 1790 to 1848 Europe and Latin America. Today, chapter 21, section 2. Stick around. Please subscribe. Please like. If you enjoy, it's free, please. Revolutions of 1830 and 1848. That's today. Too rambly? Setting the scene. The quick suppression of liberal and nationalist uprisings in 1821 did not end in Europe's age of revolutions. We are sleeping on a volcano, warned Alexis de Tocqueville, a liberal French leader who saw widespread discontent. Do you not see that earth trembles anew? A wind revolution blows and storms on the horizon. That was bad. In 1830, he said, do you not see the earth trembles anew? A wind of revolution blows. The storm is on the horizon. If you've stuck around this far, please subscribe. The French Revolution. In 1830 to 1848, Europeans saw street protests explode into full-scale revolts. What's happening out there? As in 1789, the upheavals began in Paris and radiated out across the continent. The French Revolution of 1830. New heading. When the Congress of Vienna restored Louis XVIII to French throne, he wisely issued a constitution, the Charter of French Liberties. It created two-house legislature and allowed limited freedom of the press. Still, although Louis was careful to avoid absolutism, the king retained much power. Sources of unrest. Louis's efforts at compromise satisfied few people. Ultra-royalists, the king's supporters on the far right, despised constitutional government and wanted to restore the old regime. Thus, the ultras included many high clergy and émigré nobles who had returned to France in the years after the revolution. Émigré being people that left France because they supported the royals, the monarchs, but then the revolution happened and they said, well, I don't want to get my head cut off in the guillotine, so I'm going to leave. Émigré sounds like immigrate. That's what they did because they didn't want to get their heads chopped off. And now they're called émigrés and they support royalty, monarchy, all that. The ultras being the émigrés and the high clergy, faced bitter opposition from their other factions. Liberals wanted to extend suffrage, right to vote, and win a share of power for middle-class citizens like themselves. On the left, radicals yearned for a republic like that of the 1790s. And in a working-class slum, men and women wanted what they had wanted in 1789. A decent day's pay and bread they could afford. The July Revolution. And what good bread it was. The July Revolution. When Louis XVIII died in 1824, his younger brother Charles X inherited the throne. Charles, a stronger believer in absolutism, rejected the very idea of the charter. In July of 1830, he suspended the legislature, limited the right to vote, and restricted the press. I don't like this guy. I don't like him one bit. Liberals and radicals responded forcefully to the king's challenge. In Paris, angry citizens threw up barricades across narrow streets. From behind them, they fired on other soldiers and pelted them with stones, roof tiles. Within days, rebels controlled Paris. The revolutionary tricolor, what we know today as the French flag, red, white, and blue, or blue, white, and red, I forget. Within days, rebels controlled Paris. The revolutionary tricolor flew from towers of Notre Dame Cathedral. A frightened Charles X abdicated and fled to England. Well, that's what he gets for suppressing people's rights. With the king gone, radicals wanted to set up a republic. Moderate liberals, however, insisted on the constitutional monarchy. The Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the French legislature, chose Louis Philippe as the king. He was the cousin of Charles X, and in his youth had supported the Revolution of 1789. The Citizen King. The French called Louis Philippe the Citizen King because he owed his throne to the people. Like them, he dressed in a frock coat and top hat. Sometimes he strolled the streets shaking hands with well-wishers. Liberal politicians and professionals filled his government. Under Louis Philippe, the upper bourgeoisie prospered. Louis extended suffrage, but only to France's wealthier citizens. The vast majority of people still could not vote. The king's other policies also favored the middle class at the expense of workers. The French Revolution. New heading. The French Revolution of 1848. Different than 1789, rather. In the 1840s, discontent grew. Radicals formed secret societies to work for a French republic. Utopian socialists called for an end to private ownership of property. Even liberals denounced Louis Philippe's government for corruption and called for expanded suffrage. Near the end of the decade, discontent was heightened by a recession, or a period of reduced economic activity. Factories shut down and people lost their jobs. Poor harvests caused bread prices to rise. Newspapers blamed government officials for some of the problems. As in 1789, Paris was ripe for revolution. February days. In February 1848, when the government took steps to silence critics and prevent public meetings, angry crowds took to the streets. During the February days, iron railings overturned carts, paving stones, and toppled trees again blocked the streets of Paris. Church bells rang alarms while women and men on the barricades sang the revolutionary La Marseillaise. Marseillaise. I'm sure I should know how it's pronounced, because I'm sure it's got something to do with the play Les Miserables. A number of demonstrators clashed with royal troops and were killed. As the turmoil spread, Louis Philippe abdicated. A group of liberal, radical, and socialist leaders proclaimed a second republic. The first republic had lasted from 1792 to 1804, when Napoleon became emperor. From the start, deep differences divided new government. Middle-class liberals wanted moderate political reforms. Socialists wanted far-reaching social and economic change that would help hungry workers. In the early days of the new republic, the socialists forced the government to set up national workshops to provide jobs for the unemployed. June days. And a lovely June day it is. By June, however, upper-middle-class interests had won control of the government. They saw the national workshops as a waste of money. They shut them down. Furious workers took to the streets of Paris, rallying to the cry, "Bread or lead." Bread or lead. I think lead is bullets. That's all it says. This time, however, bourgeoisie liberals turned violently against the protesters. Peasants who feared that socialists might take their land also attacked the rioting workers. At least 1,500 people were killed before the government crushed the rebellion. Yikes. June days, not lovely, like this lovely June day. No. The fighting of the June days left bitter legacy. The middle class both feared and distrusted the left, while working class nursed a deep hatred for the bourgeoisie. Louis-Napoleon. By the end of 1848, the National Assembly, dominated by members who wanted to restore order, issued constitution for the Second Republic. It created a strong precedent and a one-house legislature, but it also gave the vote to all adult men, the widest suffrage in the world at the time. 9 million Frenchmen now could vote, compared to the only 200,000 who had the right before. When elections for president were held, the overwhelming winner was Louis Napoleon. Nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. The new Napoleon attracted a working class by presenting himself as a man who cared about social issues such as poverty. At the same time, his famous name... I'm just going to start again. This isn't going well. I could be doing much better. But I really do only want to do 2 takes tops. And I already botched the intro on the first take. Should I carry on? Like and subscribe if I should carry on. That's fair. Once in office, Louis Napoleon used his position as a stepping stone to greater power. By 1852, he had proclaimed himself emperor, taking the title Napoleon III. He was the third Napoleon because the son of Napoleon I had died in his youth without ever ruling France, thus ending the short-lived Second Republic. Like his celebrated uncle, Louis Napoleon used the plebiscite to win public approval for his seizure of power. A stunning 90% of voters supported his move as to set up a second empire. Many thought that the monarchy was more stable than the republic. Millions of French hoped that Napoleon III would restore the glory of the days of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon III, like Louis Philippe, ruled at the time of rapid economic growth. For the bourgeoisie, the early days of the Second Empire brought prosperity and contentment. In time, however, Napoleon III would embark on foreign adventures and would bring down his empire and French leadership in Europe, and end French leadership in Europe. New heading. The spread of revolution. Thank you. In both 1830 and 1848, the revolts in Paris inspired uprisings to break out elsewhere in Europe. As Metternich said in last section, Metternich said, "When French seizes Europe, Europe catches a cold." I read it wrong. When French sneezes, When France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. Most of the uprisings were suppressed by military forces, but here and there rebels did win changes from the conservative governments. Even when they failed, revolutions frightened rulers badly enough to encourage reform later in the century. Belgium. One notable success of Europe's revolutionaries was in 1830, took place in Belgium. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna had united the Austrian Netherlands, present-day Belgium, and the Kingdom of Holland under the Dutch king. The Congress had wanted to create a strong barrier to help prevent French expansion in the future. The Belgians resented the new arrangement. The Belgians and Dutch had different languages, religions, and economic interests. The Belgians were Catholic, while the Dutch were Protestant. The Belgian economy was based on manufacturing, the Dutch on trade. In 1830, news of the Paris uprising that toppled Charles X ignited revolutionary sparks in Belgium. Students and workers threw up barricades in Brussels and the capital. The Dutch king turned to the other European powers for help. Britain and France knew that Belgians were threatening to disrupt the boundaries set up by the Congress of Vienna, but they believed that they would benefit from separation of Belgium and Holland. They therefore supported Belgium's demands for independence. The conservative powers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia were too busy putting down revolts for their own help to help the Dutch king. As a result, in 1831, Belgium became an independent state with a liberal constitution. Poland. Nationalists in Poland also staged an uprising in 1830, but unlike the Belgians, the Poles failed to win independence for their country. In the late 1700s, Russia, Austria, and Prussia had divided up Poland. Poles had hoped that Congress of Vienna would restore their homeland in 1815. Instead, the great powers handed most of Poland to Russia. In 1830, Polish students, army officers, and landowners rose in revolt. The rebels failed to gain widespread support, however, and were brutally crushed by the Russian forces. Some survivors fled to Western Europe and the United States, where they kept alive the dream of freedom. Carrying on. 1848, another wave of rebellion. New heading. In 1848, revolts in Paris again unleashed a tidal wave of revolution across Europe. For opponents, the old order, it was time for such hope called the springtime of the peoples. Source of discontent. Although events in France touched off revolts, grievances had been piling up for years. Unrest came from many sources. Middle-class liberals wanted a greater share of political power for themselves, as well as protections for the basic rights of all citizens. Workers demanded relief from their miseries of the Industrial Revolution. The nationalists of all classes echoed to throw off foreign rule. By 1848, discontent was so widespread that it was only a matter of time before it exploded into full-scale revolution. Metternich falls. In the Austrian Empire, a revolt broke out in Vienna, taking the government by surprise. Metternich, who had dominated Austrian politics for more than 30 years, tried to silence the students who took the streets. But when workers supported the students, Metternich resigned and fled in disguise. The Austrian emperor then promised reform. Revolution quickly spread to other parts of the empire. In Budapest, Hungarian nationalists led by Louis Kossuth demanded independent government. They also called for an end to serfdom and a written constitution to protect basic rights. In Prague, the Czechs made similar demands. Overwhelmed by events, the Austrian government agreed to reforms. The gains were temporary. Austrian troops soon regained control of Vienna and Prague. With Russian help, Austrian forces also smashed the rebels in Budapest. Many were imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. Revolution in Italy. Uprising also erupted in Italian states. Nationalists wanted to end the domination of Italy by the Austrian Habsburgs. As elsewhere, nationalists' goals were linked to the demands for liberal reform, such as the constitutional government. Workers suffering economic hardships demanded even more radical changes. From Venice in the north to Naples in the south, Italians set up independent republics. Revolutionaries even expelled the Pope from Rome and installed a nationalist government. Before long, however, the forces of reaction surged back here too. Austrian troops ousted the new government in northern Italy. A French army restored the Pope to power in Rome. In Naples, in the south, local rulers canceled the reforms they had reluctantly accepted. Turmoil in German states. And we're nearing the end of our time here, so thank you for being here. Please like and subscribe if you're still here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Turmoil in the German states. In the German states, university students passionately demanded national unity and liberal reforms. Economic hard times and a potato famine brought peasants and workers into struggle. Workers destroyed the machines that threatened their livelihoods, while peasants burned the homes of wealthy landowners. In Prussia, liberals forced King Frederick William IV to agree to a constitution written by an elected assembly. Within a year, though, he dissolved the assembly. Later, he issued his own constitution, keeping power in his own hands or those of the upper class. Frankfurt Assembly. The Frankfurt Assembly. I hope this is good because I just smiled pretty big. Throughout 1848, delegates from German states met in Frankfurt Assembly. We are to create a constitution for Germany for the whole land. I need to work on my accents. I can only do British, really. Declared one leader with a great optimism. We are to create a constitution for Germany, for the whole land, declared one leader with great optimism. Divisions soon emerged. Delegates debated endlessly on such topics as whether the new Germany should be a republic or a monarchy, and whether or not to include Austria in a united German state. Finally, the assembly offered Prussia's Frederick William IV the crown of a united Germany. To their dismay, the conservative king rejected the offer because it came not from the German princes, but from the people, from the gutter, as he described it. By early 1849, that's Frederick William IV of Prussia, people of the gutter gave him the throne rather than the gentry, or whatever you want to call it, the high class. By early 1849, the assembly was dissolved. Under the threat of Prussian military, outside of the assembly, middle-class reformers I don't know where I am. I lost it. doing a face into the camera. Not my smoothest read, I will admit. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. I do appreciate it now, don't I? I do. I look at the YouTube app compulsively, actually. Conservative forces rallied, dousing the last flames of revolt. Hundreds of people were killed. Many more went to prison. Thousands of Germans left their homeland. Most traveled to the United States, attracted by young nation's promise of democratic government and economic opportunity. There's an interesting photograph here, a painting, an etching, of the Great Sea Serpent of 1848. And it looks like there's kings on a little raft, and the sea serpent that looks like a common person that's going to devour them and their every being. I think that's an interesting photograph. I certainly think it's an interesting looking photograph. Oh, and the young man who's a sea serpent has a hat, and the hat says liberty. Looking ahead. And this will be it for today. Thank you. By 1850, rebellion faded, ending the age of liberal revolution that had begun in 1789. Why did this uprising fall? The rulers' use of military force was just one reason. In general, revolutionaries did not have mass support. In Poland, in 1830, for example, peasants did not take part in the uprising of 1848. A growing gulf divided workers seeking radical economic change and liberals pursuing moderate political reform. By the mid-century, Metternich was gone from the European scene. Still, his conservative system remained in force. In decades ahead, liberalism, nationalism, and socialism would win successes not through revolution, but through political activity. Ambitious political leaders would unify Germany and Italy. Workers would campaign for reforms through unions and ballot boxes, as they increasingly won the right to vote. I hope you all have a wonderful day. I hope you enjoy the weather. And thank you for your patience. God bless. Goodbye.